University, and I teach constitutional law, and I teach civil rights, and I teach race and law.
Okay.
Yeah, and I was a lawyer, and I did criminal cases. I worked on death cases in Texas.
Ok. Boa noite a todos. Nós vamos iniciar. Eu queria saudar, cumprimentar o professor Kenneth Williams. Ele é professor na Universidade do Texas, é professor de Direito Constitucional, de Direitos Humanos e trabalha também com raça e direito, e é advogado. Welcome. It's a pleasure, real pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here, and unfortunately, my Portuguese is not very good. So, but I will try to speak. I also have been told that I speak fast, so I will try though to speak slow so that you can understand me. Feel free if I say something that you don't understand. I'm happy to clarify what I've said. So, as the professor mentioned, that I'm a professor at Texas Tech, and one of my assignments is constitutional law. And as part of that assignment, there's in the United States currently, there's a big academic debate about the U.S. Constitution and its role in slavery. And the debate is about what role does the Constitution play with respect to slavery. Is the Constitution, as I mentioned in my headline there, was the Constitution pro-slavery? Did it actually support slavery? Or there are some who believe that it did. And then there are some who believe that the Constitution was actually anti-slavery, that it actually set the stage, ultimately, for the abolition of slavery, that starting with the Declaration of Independence and then with the Constitution, that set the stage for the ultimate abolition of slavery. So that's an ongoing academic debate in the United States. In fact, next month I'm giving the same talk. And there it's going to be more of a debate. There's going to be somebody on the other side discussing this issue. But it's a big debate among historians and constitutional law professors like myself over the role of slavery. So what I'm going to do is the role of the Constitution with respect to slavery. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to outline for you some of the arguments that are made in support of slavery, that the Constitution was pro-slavery, some of the arguments that the Constitution was anti-slavery, and then I'm going to give my own conclusions. Then I'll also talk about, in the United States right now, there's a big movement for reparations for slavery. And not only the United States, but the United Nations has enacted a resolution, a General Assembly, calling for the abolition of, obviously, slavery, that it was a horrible crime against humanity, and also calling for reparations. I'm going to talk some about that also. But there has been a movement in the United States accelerated to actually make amends and to pay reparations for slavery. But so what I'll talk about first, like I said, is the Constitution, the whole debate about the Constitution's role with respect to slavery. And I want to give you a little background on the Declaration of how the Constitution basically came to be. Let's see. Okay. Let's see here. Yeah, there you go. Okay. So some background. So the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence. And the enshrined in the Declaration was the principle that all men are created equal, that they're endowed, but they're created with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, these words were written by Thomas Jefferson. To give you some background on Thomas Jefferson, just very briefly, I'm actually in the process now of reading a book about Thomas Jefferson on race. It's an excellent book that just came out. And Thomas Jefferson, who wrote these eloquent words, he owned over 600 slaves during his lifetime. He did not free these slaves upon his death. He only freed, so he had a relationship with a teenage slave, 14 years old when the relationship started up until his death. He impregnated her 6 times, and she bore 5 children for him. He never freed her, but he did free the children that she bore on behalf of him. But so, of course, Thomas Jefferson, many people believe, kind of embodies the contradiction of the United States. The United States has been has tried to be a beacon of freedom on the one hand, but also a white supremacist republic on the other. And who better embodies that than Thomas Jefferson? So, but of course, he played a very important role in creating the Declaration of Independence and ultimately the Constitution. So 1787, the Constitution, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was ratified and it was signed. There were, by the way, words in the original Declaration of Independence condemning slavery that Jefferson wrote. Jefferson actually wrote words in the original Declaration of Independence condemning slavery. He wanted to blame it all on the British, but the British forced the states, the Americas, into having slavery. But those words were removed because the Declaration never would have been ratified by the slave states. They would have objected and never have ratified it had there been these anti-slavery words attached to the Declaration. But so we had the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution was established in 1789 to basically put into practice this ideal, and the ideals from the Declaration of Independence, okay? So we had the Declaration of Independence, we had the Constitution comes along. However, slavery persisted in the United States for 76 years after these two wonderful documents were established and ratified. So the question comes up, well, how could that have happened? How could that have possibly happened? That you would have these two wonderful documents that, okay, it looks like something, okay, my notes. But anyhow, okay, I'll just go, okay. Okay, so yeah, how could you have this slavery persist for over 90 years after the Declaration of Independence and after 76 years after the Constitution? Okay, Frederick Douglass, in one of his most famous speeches, pointed out this hypocrisy. He actually gave a speech, what to the slave is the 4th of July? And where he pointed out the hypocrisy. On the one hand, the United States is celebrating the independence from Britain, but on the other hand, all these freedoms, but on the other hand, they've enslaved over millions of people. And how can that be reconciled? That was the point of his speech. And to this very day, most African Americans in the United States do not celebrate the 4th of July. Most African Americans don't celebrate that as a holiday because it doesn't really, going back to Thomas Jefferson, it doesn't really have any meaning to a lot of African Americans given the fact that our ancestors were enslaved. So most African Americans actually celebrate June 19th, 1865 was the day that slavery ended in the United States. And that actually is a federal holiday Joe Biden signed into law when he was president. And so that's the day that most African Americans celebrate because of the hypocrisy. They don't celebrate July 4th. It's not a big day for my family, for instance. We never would have picnics or celebrations for July 4th. But now we do have a big picnic and celebration on June, we call it Juneteenth, June the 18th, okay? So going back to the Constitution of the United States has all these, so why is there a debate over the Constitution? Let's talk about that, the academic debate. Okay, there are 11 clauses in the Constitution that deal with slavery. And I'm going to talk about some of the clauses that are hotly debated as to the impact that it had on slavery, okay? So let me go through some of the arguments as to the Constitution being pro-slavery. What are some of the arguments that are made, okay? Well, one argument is that, well, the Constitution never actually prohibited slavery. The United States Constitution never prohibited the practice of slavery, okay? There was no mention of it being prohibited. It is pointed out, for instance, there are certain practices that are prohibited under the Constitution. One practice that's prohibited is the prohibition against ex post facto laws. Those are laws, for instance, that you can't convict somebody for something that was not a crime when they actually engaged in the conduct. There was also a prohibition against bills of attainder. So there were certain prohibitions in the United States Constitution, but slavery was not prohibited by the Constitution. So that's one of the things that is pointed out, just the absence of any language condemning slavery. If the Constitution is supposed to be anti-slavery, shouldn't it have condemned slavery? Okay, we needed the 13th, that's why we needed the 13th Amendment after the post-war amendments after the Civil War. We needed the 13th Amendment to outlaw slavery. So that's one argument that's made. Another argument that's made that the Constitution is pro-slavery and was pro-slavery was that there was no mention of equality in the Constitution. Okay, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence did actually state, of course, that all men are created equally, but there was no mention of any equality in the actual Constitution. Again, we needed the 14th Amendment. We needed the post-Civil War amendments, the big three amendments after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery, the 14th Amendment, which granted equal protection and due process, and we needed the 15th Amendment, which provided the former slaves the right to vote. But so the argument is made that we would not have needed those amendments had there been equality mentioned in the Constitution. So that's an argument that's made. Another argument that's made that the Constitution was pro-slavery is that slavery is the only private institution, a private property, that was actually granted protection under the Constitution, okay? It was the only institution that was actually granted protection under the Constitution, okay? And how was it granted protection? It was granted protection under the fugitive slave law, okay? There's a provision in the Constitution called the fugitive slave law. Basically, the way that works, so, you know, the United States, all the colonies had slavery. The northern colonies ultimately abolished slavery, and slavery, though, persisted in the South, the southern part of the United States, okay? So what would happen is that you would have slaves who would escape from the South, they would go to the North, okay? To protect the slave owners' property back then, the Constitution included the provision for the return of individuals who has escaped from slavery. Okay, that was called the fugitive slave law. It's the only provision in the entire Constitution that protected a specific type of property. Okay, for instance, if somebody owned horses or somebody owned cattle, okay, and if that was taken, there was no provision in the Constitution that would allow that property to be returned. Only slaves, there was only provision for returning slaves in the Constitution, okay? So the argument is made that, of course, the Constitution was pro-slavery. It protected the institution of slavery. It protected the slave owners' property, their financial interests. And the only type of property that was protected, why would you single out this form of property if it's not, the Constitution was not pro-slavery? So that's another argument that's made, okay? Another big argument is, in terms of the Constitution being pro-slavery, there was called the 3/5 clause. And the way the 3/5 clause worked is that, so in the United States, we have two branches of Congress. I think you do here in Brazil also, right? We have the House of Representatives and we have the Senate. The Senate is, every state, we have 50 states, every state gets two senators, regardless of population. However, the House of Representatives is a portion based on population, okay? And so the compromise, they call it the Connecticut Compromise, okay? They came up with this three-fifths clause. So white people would be counted as a person. Blacks and the slaves would be counted as three-fifths of a person, okay? And that's oftentimes pointed out to show how black people were dehumanized. They weren't even counted as full persons. So why would that be pro-slavery? The reason why it's pro-slavery is that it gave strength to the southern slaveholding states, okay? So the southern states obviously didn't allow the slaves to vote, but they could use the slaves to enhance their political power. So to give you an example how this worked, if you didn't have the three-fifths clause, at the time, Pennsylvania would have been the largest state with the largest representation. But because of the three-fifths clause, Virginia was the largest state and had the largest representation, okay? So why was this important? How did this enhance slavery? Well, it gave a lot of power to the southern states. It meant that they had a veto power over any attempt to abolish slavery, any attempts to modify slavery. They actually had the authority under the Constitution, they had the power in Congress to prevent the ultimate abolition. One of the reasons why we had a Civil War was because there was no way legislatively to abolish slavery. The only way to abolish it was through a Civil War, which ultimately occurred. So the three-fifths clause gave a tremendous power to the southern states, not only in terms of representation in Congress, but it also gave the southern slaveholding states a lot of representation in terms of electing the president. So we have this very quirky system you might have heard of that no other country in the world has. Okay? We have what's called electoral college. Okay? And the way it works is that, so here in Brazil, I know you have an election coming up. And whoever gets Lula, Bolsonaro, whoever gets the most votes become president. That's not necessarily the case in the United States. In fact, we've had since 2000, we've had 2 presidents elected who did not receive a majority of the vote, George Bush and Donald Trump, his first time. Okay? And how does that happen? It happens because we have the Electoral College. So what happens is each state has, they send electors to the Electoral College, and that's where the president is selected. And the states, the number of electors in the state depends on the population of that state. And so, for instance, Texas, I live in the second largest state. We have the second largest number of electors, okay? California would have the most, okay? Going back to my example, during slavery, Virginia had the largest delegation because they were able to count the slaves that increased their representation, and the number of votes you have in the Electoral College is dependent upon the number of representatives that you have, your representation, okay? So how does that impact slavery? That means that 8 of the 12, of our first 12 presidents, 8 were slave owners, okay? 8 of them owned slaves. So it gave not only power to the southern states to, in terms of Congress, but it also gave them power, the southern states, in terms of the electoral, the election of a president in the Electoral College, okay? And that power continues today. So the Electoral College has a big impact on how we elect our president. So the three-fifths clause was very important for the slaveholding states. And they would not have signed on to the Constitution but for this clause. So that's another argument that's made in terms of the Constitution being pro-slavery, okay? You had this three-fifths clause that gave tremendous power to the southern states, okay? I mentioned the Fugitive Slave Clause, the only clause in the Constitution that protected property, institution of property. By the way, that clause was upheld by the Supreme Court. It's a case called Prigg versus Pennsylvania. Supreme Court said that basically that clause, there were some northern states that prohibited the state official. So let me go into more detail about the Fugitive Slave Clause so you can understand how it would work, okay? So a slave, let's say, leaves Texas, escapes to New York, okay? The Fugitive Slave Clause required New York state officials to apprehend the slave and return that slave to their owner, okay? On demand, in the Constitution it said on demand, which meant that all the slave owner had to do was say, this is my slave, and that slave was returned to that owner. Okay? There was nothing else. Owner didn't have to go to New York to testify. He would just have to submit an affidavit. This is my slave, and that slave was returned. And the state officials and states that were opposed to slavery, states that had abolished slavery, states like Vermont. Vermont, by the way, was the first constitution in the world that prohibited slavery. But Vermont, because of the fugitive slave law, Vermont was a very strong anti-slavery state. Harriet Tubman, a lot of the people she helped to escape from slavery, they went to Vermont. Vermont was very abolitionist state. But even in Vermont, officials were forced to return slaves to the slave owners, okay, against their wishes. And so fugitive slave law was very important. So the Supreme Court confronted the question at Prigg versus Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had a law that prohibited state officials from participating in that process, okay? And what the Supreme Court said, no, federal law trumps state law. And so you have to, state officials, even though you don't like slavery, even though you find it repugnant, you must participate in return of these slaves. You must participate in this institution. And so the argument is made, how could you say the Constitution was nothing but pro-slavery if you have this sort of coercion and involved and allowed for in the Constitution? So that's another argument that is made. You also had what's called the Insurrection Clause. There was a clause in the Constitution that provided the federal government with the authority to put down any sort of insurrections or any sort of rebellions, okay? And this allowed the federal government to do so. So if you had there were a couple of times that the United States military used this clause to prevent and to stop anti-slavery rebellions and insurrections. There was a famous insurrection by a slave called Nat Turner, okay? He was a slave in Virginia, and he started an insurrection. They went around Virginia killing slave owners. And it was the federal government that actually stopped that through this insurrection clause, okay? There was another anti-slavery at Harper's Ferry. It was an anti-slavery rebellion by a white guy named John Brown. Okay. Again, it was the United States military, because of this insurrection clause, that put down these rebellions. And so again, the argument is made, well, you have this provision in the Constitution that allows for the federal government to get involved in these rebellions and these insurrections, and that enhanced the power of slavery and the slave owners. They had not only local officials who would help them in terms of putting down any sort of insurrection by their slaves, but the federal government had to participate in that process. And again, half the country was opposed to slavery, didn't have slavery, but they still had to participate in this institution of slavery. So that argument is also made. Then we had a provision of the Constitution that prohibited, okay, I guess I should move this along. Okay, we had a provision in the Constitution that prohibited any sort of exports, any sort of taxes on exports. And how did that promote slavery? Well, that promoted slavery because most exports were created by slaves. Okay, sugar, cotton, rice, those sort of exports. Most of the things that were exported were actually produced by slaves, so that promoted slavery. Okay, that provision of the Constitution. There were no taxes, so it made slavery more profitable. Okay, you didn't have to worry about your exports being taxed, so that encouraged slavery. Okay, and then we also have a provision of the Constitution, what's called the 3/4 clause. So we have the 3/5 clause, which counted slaves as 3/5 of a person, and then we have the 3/4 clause. So basically, our Constitution can only be amended with a supermajority of the Congress. We need 2/3 of Congress to vote to amend the Constitution. Then we need 3/4 of the states to do so. So we're going back to how it's related to the 3/5 clause. So the slave states had the power in Congress to prevent any sort of amendment to the Constitution. Let's say Congress at some point, let's say the Republicans, Lincoln won the election. Okay, let's say they wanted to abolish slavery. Well, they would have, the slave states would be able to prevent that from happening. Okay, because of the 3/4, the fact that you need a super majority. And also you need so you need not only 2/3 of the Congress, but you also need 3/4 of the states to agree to an amendment of the Constitution. Well, the slave states never would have gone along with any sort of amendment that would prohibit or limit slavery, okay, against their interests. So those are the arguments that are made that the Constitution was pro-slavery. And then I guess the last point that is made is that the Constitution never would have been ratified had it actually been anti-slavery. The Southern delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, they never would have ratified the Constitution had it been any sort of anti-slavery document. That's the other argument that's made, okay? And so the fact that it's anti-slavery, let's talk about that, okay? So those are other arguments. Constitution is pro-slavery, it accommodated slavery, and without question. And, so what are the arguments that are made by the other side? They call themselves now the anti-slavery constitutionalists, anti-slavery constitutionalism, okay? And their argument is that basically the Constitution reflects the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, okay? And the principle of fundamental human equality was carried over to the Constitution. Okay, so you have the Constitution saying all men are created equal, endowed with certain inalienable rights, and then that principle was carried over to the Constitution. So how is that? Okay, so they make the argument, one, that slavery is actually never mentioned in the Constitution. Even the fugitive, I was talking about the fugitive slave clause. Slavery is actually not mentioned in that clause. Okay, it talks about the return of a person, of laborer, to the person to whom their labor is owed. But they actually never use, it certainly was understood as a fugitive slave and that it was applicable to slavery. But they actually never used the word slavery in that clause or anywhere in the Constitution. So that's one argument that is made. Slavery is not mentioned anywhere in the Insurrection Clause. Says nothing about slavery. 3/5 Clause says nothing about slavery. It just says that 3/5 of persons of African descent could be counted as 3/5 of those who are held could be counted as, they would be counted as 3/5 of a person. But it actually never says slaves. It actually never says the word slave. Okay, so that's one argument that is made. They point out the fact that the Southern delegates to the convention did try to get the Constitution to protect slavery. There was a big debate about that, and it was rejected, okay? The Southern delegates wanted the Constitution to recognize, quote, unquote, property and humans. The Southern delegates, John Calhoun and senators from southern states, slave-owning states, the slave owners themselves, they wanted the Constitution specifically to protect slavery, what they called property and humans. And the delegates to the convention refused to do that. So that's one argument that's made. Another argument that the Constitution was actually anti-slavery, that it did not actually protect slavery, okay? Another argument that's made is that there's nothing in the Constitution that would have prohibited Congress from abolishing slavery, okay? The Southern delegates, again, tried but failed to get the Constitution to prohibit the abolition of slavery. and the delegates refused to do that. Okay, so that is true. There's nothing in the Constitution that would have prohibited the actual, specifically the abolition of slavery. But as I pointed out, from a practical standpoint, given the 3/5 clause, 3/4 clause, actually it would have been extremely difficult to abolish slavery short of the Civil War. Okay, another argument that's pointed out is that there was the importation clause, that the Constitution actually did ban slavery and the importation of slaves into the United States starting in 1808. Okay, but one thing that's pointed out about that, a couple of things about that clause. So basically the way the clause works, the Congress passed in 1806 a clause banning the importation of slaves into the United States starting in 1808. So they delayed it for a couple of years, okay? And a couple of things about that. So even though this importation clause was passed, it prohibited any amendment of the 1808 date. So it cannot be banned slavery until 1808. The importation of slaves cannot be banned, and that date cannot change, okay? And so the question you might have, well, the slaveholders, why did they go along with that provision? And the reason why they went along with that provision is that they thought that their population growth, because of the power that the Constitution had given to the slaveholding states, that they didn't need to import any more. And at the time in the United States, most slaves were actually being produced domestically. Okay, they were not there was not a big reliance on the importation of slaves. Okay, when this clause was enacted in 1808, most slaves were produced domestically. We had slave plantations that were called breeder plantations, and that's what all they did. They just bred slaves. Okay, and so there wasn't the same need for importation of slaves when this provision was enacted. And also it reflected the worldwide, what was happening worldwide, basically, okay? Most of the countries in the world had, England, for instance, most countries in the world had prohibited the importation of slaves, and the United States kind of joined in that movement. But that's one argument that is made, that the Constitution was actually anti-slavery, that they did include this importation clause banning the importation of slaves, okay? Another argument that's made is that, well, if the Constitution was pro-slavery and it was not anti-slavery, well, the slave states, we never would have had a civil war. Why did the South succeed if the Constitution was actually pro-slavery? They wouldn't have had a need to succeed if the Constitution was pro-slavery, okay? So that argument is, I'll talk about that more in detail, but yeah, so you did have the southern states, as soon as Lincoln was elected, they succeeded from the country and started, that was the start of the Civil War. Obviously, tried to establish their own country, okay? So that argument is made. And the other argument that's made was that there are certain provisions of the Constitution that's just incompatible with slavery, okay? The preamble, for instance, of the Constitution talks about the Declaration of Independence of the Constitution, talks about the blessings of liberty. We the people establish justice, okay, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty. All those provisions are incompatible with slavery, and race is not mentioned in any of those. There was no limitation in terms of race. So, for instance, the Constitution didn't say we, the white people. It didn't say establish justice for white people. It was, there was no mention of race. And so the argument is that it was incompatible to speak these words and not have the intent of actually abolishing slavery. We have other provisions of the Constitution that embodies an anti-slavery position. Fourth Amendment of our Constitution prohibits the seizure, unreasonable seizure of people, of individuals. Okay? Due process clause requires due process before a person's liberty is being denied. Okay, and then finally, some of the strongest arguments that are made are the statements of Frederick Douglass. Okay, so let's see. Can we? Okay. Yeah. Okay. No. Okay. Okay. I want you to see the words of Frederick Douglass. Okay. Let's see here. Okay. Yeah. Is that it? Okay. Yeah. The previous one. Okay. So oftentimes they cite the actual words of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass made certain statements. He argued, actually, he and Abraham Lincoln, that the Constitution was anti-slavery. And for instance, he said that Frederick Douglass, I have up here on the screen here, some of the statements of Frederick Douglass. And he said, for instance, that he called the Constitution, quote, a glorious liberty document. Okay. He also said, now take the Constitution according to his plain reading, and I defy the presentation of a single pro-slavery clause in it. On the other hand, it will be found to contain principles and purposes entirely hostile to the existence of slavery. He said also, if the Constitution were intended to be by its framers and adopted as a slaveholding instrument, then why would neither slavery, slaveholding, nor slave be anywhere found in it? Okay. Abolish slavery tomorrow, and not a sentence or syllable of the Constitution need be altered. The plain language of the Constitution is, we the people, not we the white people, not we the citizens, not we the privileged class, not we the high, not we the low, not we of English extraction, not we of French or Scotch extraction, but we the people. So Frederick Douglass, that's a big argument that's made. Frederick Douglass himself was arguing that the Constitution was anti-slavery. And so was Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was arguing that the Constitution also was anti-slavery. He made the argument that the Constitution refused to recognize ownership in people, property and persons. Okay? So those are some of the arguments that are made in terms of the Constitution being pro or anti-slavery. So my conclusions, how do I feel about my conclusions, okay? I think it was deliberately ambiguous, but functionally pro-slavery, the Constitution. Why was that? Because the only way to actually form the nation and have the southern states, so the Constitution couldn't be explicitly either way. It couldn't be explicitly pro-slavery because then the abolitionist states up north would not have joined the Union. And then it could not have been anti-slavery explicitly because the southern slaveholding states never would have joined the Union. So it was a compromise. They compromised. Okay, that's one reason, for instance, they never used the word slavery. It was all a compromise. Okay, but it certainly was. It was designed to not interfere in the slavery institution. It was designed not to, for the federal government not to interfere in that institution. But those who make the anti-slavery argument are correct that it never explicitly did so, but it certainly was functionally, I think, pro-slavery, okay? And then the other thing is that the Constitution is just undeniable. It gave tremendous power to the slaveholding states. So short of a civil war, the slavery would have perpetuated for a long time in the United States. You ended slavery 35 years, I think, after we did, and we probably would have been after you had we not had a civil war in terms of the abolition of slavery, okay? The provisions of the Constitution were so pro-slavery that we had Supreme Court decisions that interpreted the Constitution as pro-slavery. We had the infamous Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was a slave who was taken to a free state, and he sued over his freedom, arguing that, well, once he was in a free state, he became free. And the Supreme Court said, no, the intention of the Constitution was never to recognize slaves as we the people. The Supreme Court said that. Dred Scott, Roger Taney, who wrote the decision, an infamous Supreme Court justice. He said, no, slaves or free blacks, any person of African descent, the Constitution was never intended, according to this decision, to include people of African descent, okay? And he said in that decision that the Constitution of the black people, persons of African descent, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. So he recognized his interpretation of the Constitution was that the Constitution was was pro-slavery, was an anti-slave, okay? And then so the question comes up, well, what about Frederick Douglass? Why was Frederick Douglass arguing that the Constitution was anti-slavery? Well, my response would be that when you're a good lawyer, you argue what you have, okay? Well, he didn't have the 13th Amendment. He didn't have the 14th Amendment, okay? He didn't have the 15th Amendment. He didn't have all these civil rights laws that were subsequently passed, okay? What did he have in his arsenal to argue against slavery? He had two things. He had the Declaration of Independence, which said, you know, what it said, and he had the Constitution, which made certain general and spoke to certain general principles, okay? So he was trying to make the best case he could to free his people, okay? Why didn't the framers actually then mention slavery in the Constitution? Well, most of the framers, even though many were slave owners, they recognized that slavery would not be perpetual, that it wouldn't be indefinite, that at some point slavery would end. You know, the book that I'm reading now, Thomas Jefferson on race, he recognized that slavery would not be an indefinite institution, that one day there would be emancipation. So I think the framers were embarrassed to put, they knew the Constitution would be a perpetual document, and they didn't want to put the word slavery in this document that is going to, they had hoped and they had planned to live on in infamy. And so they didn't want to include it in the Constitution. So that's why I think that the Constitution never actually mentioned slavery. But I think it's hard to make the case that the Constitution didn't actually accommodate slavery through the powers that it gave to the southern slaveholding states, and also I think the fugitive slave provision, also the uniqueness of that provision, and again that's the only provision in the Constitution that protected a form of property. There's no other provision in the Constitution that protects a certain type of property the way the fugitive slave provision did. Okay, so that in a nutshell are an overview of some of the arguments that are made. Do you want me to go into reparations, or do you want me to answer questions about this? Just go into reparations? Okay. Okay, okay.
But also,
Fala das reparations ou vai direto na question? What do you prefer?
Oh, however you want to do it. I think maybe some people might have questions now,
Okay,
and maybe,
okay,
yeah,
yeah.
okay. Well, it's fresh in their minds. Maybe they can
Okay,
ask
yeah,
questions.
okay, that's a good idea, it's better.
Okay. Any questions, perguntas? Yeah.
I was just taking a look. I was looking here in our first constitution from 1824.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 1824, and the word slave is not there.
It's not mentioned.
Escravo is not mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked for, well, of course, I took a very quick look at, and the servil also not, which is another word that, a lighter word for the situation. It was very interesting. And I was trying to look here too, there was a Brazilian author, yeah, I remember the name of the book now. And there is a Brazilian author very known from that time, from the early, from the 18th century, whose name is José de Alencar, very known. We read his books in school. And I was looking for some books someday, and I found a very short book like that with writings from José de Alencar, from newspapers publication. And the name of this book is José de Alencar, Letters for Slave, not against slave, for slave. And it was, and I read this book. I think everybody should read that to understand what the feeling, what the thinking of that period in Brazil was, because those letters are terrible. Marcelo and I were talking about that now, listening to you, And those letters are terrible. You cannot believe that you are reading that, but that's something very important about the spirit of the time. But about the Constitution, one of the things that I like to talk to my students about, and that really amazes me, is, of course, you were talking about the American Constitution from the early years and all, but the equal but separate, the idea of equality, even after the independence, is something that amazes me. Of course, it's part of the American history,
Our
but
experience,
that's something that you cannot say that the Constitution was against slavery, when even after that, you have
we
the...
had separate but equal.
the
Yeah,
se-
and we
separate
had
but
the-
equal, yeah.
We had the three
Not equal, but separate, sorry.
Right, we had the three beautiful amendments, which I teach in
Yeah.
my constitutional law class,
Yeah.
13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but they were never enforced.
Yeah.
Till the 1960s. So we had apartheid, you were just in South Africa. We
Yeah.
had apartheid, we
Yeah,
just didn't
yeah,
call it that.
yeah.
But we had apartheid in the United States for about 70 years, till the 1960s. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's hard to,
There is a friend of mine gave me a book, which is very hard to read too, but very interesting, about a song. Billie Holiday sang it, that everybody should listen to it. It's called "Strange Fruit." That's something that you can see the pain in that, the death, and it was very. It amazes me. I can understand. I can't understand. So I found your lecture very interesting because that makes us think about that time
that time.
and
yeah,
the
yeah.
today's, because we have today's problems too, because they are different, of course, but we have
Right, but a lot of the problems we have in the United States that black people have derive from slavery. We have, economic inequalities and
yeah.
political
Same here.
inequalities, and we have, all sorts of issues. But I would say a lot of them just derive from slavery.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
for instance, white people have 10 times the amount of wealth that black people have in the United States. And so that's just a
Yeah.
derivative from slavery.
it's not
I mean,
different
it's
here.
no,
It's not different here.
Yeah, yeah. So, and going back to, so Jefferson, keep in mind too, these people who wrote the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson, these were aristocrats. So the sort of question, why would they be ashamed of including slavery in the document?
Yeah.
But they were aristocrats, so they recognized, Jefferson thought, he knew slavery would not be perpetual. He knew they would eventually be emancipated. He had friends that he would have dinner with. They would have dinners, and they would talk about the Enlightenment and the liberty and John Stuart Mills, and they recognized that what they were doing could not continue indefinitely. Jefferson recognized that it was wrong. He wrote in the Declaration of Independence that slavery was wrong. Okay, it was exercised from it, but he recognized that. So that's why they didn't want to include it in the Constitution. But it was profitable. Jefferson was the biggest hypocrite. He owned over 600 slaves. He traded slaves for liquor. He traded slaves for horses. Okay, the founder of the Declaration of Independence and the one who wrote all these beautiful words in our Declaration that led to our Constitution. It came from him. Like I said, he embodies more than anybody the contradictions of America. The beacon of freedom versus a white supremacist republic. Even after we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, we immediately go from slavery to an apartheid system.
Yeah.
By the way, there's a famous book that was written. It was called Slavery by Another Name. And what they would do after slavery was the 14th Amendment. What they would do, southern states, they passed, Maryland, different southern states, they passed what's called vagrancy laws. So they see a black person out on the streets, they go arrest them, they get convicted, they get fined. Of course, they don't have the money to pay the fine. So what happens? They go to jail. The southern states would then lease them to private companies, and they would provide labor to these, without compensation, obviously, to these private, very dangerous jobs in mines and building railroad tracks, stuff like that. Not paid at all. And famous book, Slavery by Another Name, if you ever want to check it out. But anyhow, you had a question?
Could you
Yeah,
please-
because I can't hear
Could
you.
you,
Yeah.
microphone, because we are
Recording.
recording.
I beg your pardon for my rusty English, but in a country that still protects the
Yeah, no, we are
Porque tá
recording,
gravando.
yeah.
I beg your pardon for my rusty English, but in a country that still protects the KKK existence, wouldn't be cynical or revisionist to still defend the constitutional anti-slavery stake? That's my question.
Okay. Yeah, so we do. Yes, we do protect what's called hate speech. I've been studying that, and one of the things I hope to do here in Brazil. Yeah, you said. Mm-hmm. 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 Our Constitution, the First Amendment, values freedom of speech, and so over equality and over everything else. And so that's why I know here in Brazil you have restrictions on hate speech. One of the things I have been studying that, but we can't do that in the United States. Our Supreme Court says we can't have any sort of restrictions. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think the microphone. Okay.
No.
Mm-hmm.
You can, but you should speak.
I'm sorry, I'm kind of nervous right now.
Mm-hmm.
So my question was about the thing that happened when they arrested people and put them in like farms for work, labor, in lower prices. So this also happens in Brazil, but this isn't even a debate here. My partner works in a construction field, and there almost all the workers are people in jail, and they receive a minimum wage. I don't know if they receive a minimum wage in the United States.
They
think
don't
not.
receive, no.
Which
And
is
during
worse.
this time period, they didn't receive at all any sort of. And in fact, what would happen? They would stay in prison forever. They would just die in prison. They die as basically slaves. Yeah, they were never released. They would just work until they died. Yeah. Because they could never have the money to pay these fines. Oh, and so what would they do? The way they would get around that, so they would actually charge them for labor, for room, board, food, etc. So of course they could never get out of debt. So they would arrest them, make them work in a mine, a farm, etc. They would charge them, and they could of course they never had the money to pay. And so they would never be released. So they spent their entire lives basically as slaves.
Of course they do.
Yeah,
That wouldn't be
yeah.
profitable at all to release them.
Right.
But
Mm-hmm.
so I think Brazil is actually behind the United States in that aspect, because this isn't even a debate here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you probably will agree with me as a specialist in human rights, that lacks in human rights in so many ways.
Sure.
And when my boyfriend came to tell me, oh, this is a good idea, I was, really? You really think that? Everybody really agrees with that? So my question for you is, how can be this negative for these people in Brazil and in the United States?
Well, I've been coming to Brazil since 2013. I was a Fulbright at UFABA in Bahia. And one thing I've noticed is that we have a very assertive black community in the United States. You obviously have heard about Martin Luther King, but even now, we're very, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, all that. We have a very assertive black community in the United States. I don't see the same assertiveness among the black community here in Brazil. I don't see the same assertiveness, so I think that's one of the issues that you have here. I think for what I've observed is that so you have more, it looks like more social interaction among the races here. We don't have as much social interaction in the United States. We have, black neighborhoods, we have black everything in the United States. Black, separate, it's not legally required, but black people tend to be with black people, white people tend to be with white people. We have segregation. Even our schools now are segregated. We have universities. One time I worked at a university, it was a black university. So I notice here in Brazil, you don't have those same sort of limitations, but you also don't have the assertiveness. We've had a lot of social justice movements started by black people in the United States and continuing, yeah.
So this is an aspect that I observe, sorry for the word, but I think that the apartheid in this situation was, I don't want to say great, but it came a lot black communities. Here in Brazil, we don't have this power. The black people don't see them as a group. They need to.
You don't have the cohesion. See, and I think I understand what might have happened here. Okay, so when you ended slavery, you never actually had official discrimination. We call it Jim Crow laws. See, in the United States, what happened was after slavery ended, we had Jim Crow laws, which basically prohibited black people from going to white schools, going to parks. So by law, that was prohibited. You never had that here in Brazil. And so I think what developed, because we had separate but equal, as the professor mentioned, that developed cohesiveness. We developed communities in the United States and businesses. And we have a much more cohesive black community in the United States than you do in Brazil because of the separate but equal laws.
So I just think that the segregation was obvious, the worst, but the results of it in the United States are, I can't find the words, but it's like in a community that fights for their rights.
Right. One reason I was going to talk about reparations is that that's actually a movement that is growing in the United States, the demand for reparations. So I guess I can turn to that now? Okay. Yeah, so in the United States, we actually have a movement now that is demanding, a serious movement, that is demanding reparations for slavery. Let's see if I can get this. Okay. Can you? Okay. It's, okay. Okay, that's what it is. You have to have the mouse hit the, okay. So we actually have a movement in the United States that are demanding reparations for the descendants of slavery. So reparations basically means that it's making amends for a wrong or an injustice that was done to a group of people. And oftentimes it involves a payment of money, but it also could include other forms, such as, for instance, an apology. There have been instances of reparations where, in the United States, for instance, where apologies were given. I'll talk about that, okay? But there is a demand because of slavery for reparations to be paid. And this demand has been bolstered by the United States General Assembly, which in March of this year, they adopted a resolution. They found that slavery and the slave trade was, quote, the gravest crime against humanity ever. So the gravest, the most serious crime, the worst crime against humanity. They found the slavery and the slave trade. And it calls for reparations. there were 3 countries that voted against the resolution passed the General Assembly. 3 countries voted against it. The United States was one of them. Okay. Also, Argentina, your neighbor, voted against it. And also Israel, our kind of friend, but that's changing in the United States. Yeah. But so there's a real demand in the United States to pay reparations to black people for by the way, no country in the world has paid reparations for slavery. Obviously, here in Brazil, you had slavery. You have not paid. Now, we'll give Brazil credit. Brazil was the only country that was actively involved in slavery that actually did vote for this resolution. Okay, the European countries all abstained. So, the United States, of course, voted against it, but all the European countries, except for Russia and Belarus. Those are only 2 European countries that voted for the resolution. Okay, and Russia's trying to cultivate a relationship with Africa. That's why they did that. And Belarus is a puppet of Russia. Okay, but England, France, Germany, all those countries voted against. Not voted against. They abstained because of the issue of reparations. Because those were countries that obviously benefited from slavery and were involved in the slave trade. And so that's why they voted against it. Okay. So the Trump administration, by the way, their justification, they gave a couple of reasons. One was that they don't like the idea of having a hierarchy of wrongs. So they object to calling slavery the gravest crime against humanity. They say that we shouldn't have a hierarchy of wrongs, that if it's wrong, it's wrong, and you shouldn't try to have a hierarchy. And then also, the argument is that reparations shouldn't be paid because of the fact that at the time, slavery was lawful. And so you shouldn't pay reparations for something that was lawful at the time. There is debate about that. There is actually, in the resolution, they dispute that. They argue that there's a principle in international law, I think we have a couple of international law students there, a principle called jus cogens, that there, as slavery actually was, even when it was being practiced, it was still against the law, okay? Even though there were, obviously, most nations did allow the practice to occur. It's sort of like in Germany, you know, the tribunal recognized and held that even though under German law, what Hitler did was lawful, it actually was a violation of the law. Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hello, Professor. It's a pleasure. I want to ask you something about what did you said when you talked about in the U.S. There's something that is not quite like legal, but it happens that we have
The segregation?
the segregation.
Yeah.
Talking about black communities, black hood, black schools, and all about that. And you said that here in Brazil we don't have that.
You
Right.
don't have, right.
That-
It doesn't seem to be the same.
Yeah.
From what
That's
I
the thing.
observed.
You
Yeah.
think that it's nice and it's good for the people to have that segregation. What I'm asking is if you think that it's better for the black community to have something quite segregated. I think that's the word. And that's a thing that you can see, all people can see and live and feel that, or you'll feel that it's better here in Brazil, the way it is, the way it's not quite, we can't see that the people are more mixed, I think. I don't know the reason about that, but yeah, I think it's about historical and mixed, formation that the people in Brazil have.
You have more social interaction here
you
in
know,
Brazil among
that
racial lines
the-
than we do in the United
exactly.
States.
That's
Yeah,
that's
right.
the point.
Correct.
So you think it's it's better in U.S. or here in Brazil, the way it happens?
Well, I think it's a paradox because of the fact that the United States, we do have a more cohesive black community, and we have made demands for equality and for a better economic. One thing I've observed, we have very strong black community. We have very strong black neighborhoods. We have very wealthy black neighborhoods in the United States. We have a strong middle class black community in the United States. I don't see that here in Brazil, in all honesty. I've spent a lot of time in Bahia. I spent time in Rio, and I don't see a real strong black community. And we have that in the United States. Now, it is nice, though, that you have the social interaction, you have better understanding of each other, but it looks like what might have happened because of the social interaction, maybe you don't have the same cohesiveness in the black community, and it obscures the other inequalities that exist. I see tremendous inequality here, especially among the black people here in Brazil. They seem very poor. I don't see, like I said, we have strong, you go to Houston, Dallas, New York, any city in the United States, Los Angeles, you're gonna see a black middle class, you're gonna see a black upper class, you're gonna see beautiful black homes, you're gonna see very successful black people, okay? You don't really see a lot of that here in Brazil. And that's the downside, I guess, to not having a more cohesive community. So that we benefited in a way from separate but equal because we developed that strong black community. And now we make demand. So now we have a real demand for reparations. Look what happened. You know, we were having a discussion earlier. So we have George Floyd, black people being killed by police. We have demonstrations. We have riots. We make demands that you have to change. I understand a lot of black people get killed by the police here in Brazil. Nothing happens.
It's like it's like a strong in a political way. It's kind of it's stronger if you have a black community. It's stronger politically saying, right?
Right, correct. But
Yeah.
I mean, think about it this way. We've had black everything in terms of public officials. We've had a black president, black vice president. We've had black people on the Supreme Court. We have 2 black people on the Supreme Court now. We have black governor, mayor, everything.
Yeah.
One thing that shocks me, like I'm in Bahia, which is a majority black place, but everybody's white who runs the city.
Yeah.
That would never happen in the United States, never.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Cities with Atlanta, New York, New Orleans, all of those cities have black mayors.
That's
Yeah, and have black people running those communities. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay. You had a question? Mm.
Yes, my question is on how you frame your presentation, thinking of 2 ways of interpreting the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
The Constitution accepts is pro-slavery or anti-slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking that this presentation or this way of framing the question has to do with the last part, which is the reparations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In order to defend reparation, I think it's important to say that there is one right way to read the Constitution,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which is the Constitution does not accept slavery, even though the people who practiced the Constitution were slave owners and were white supremacists. The way they read the Constitution was incorrect from the start.
Right.
Because in constitutionalism, in modern constitutionalism, freedom and equality are 2 principles. I think this is what exactly was disputed by the Haitian Constitution and the Haitian Revolution, which the French Revolution and the American Revolution did not manage to frame correctly, right? The Haitian Constitution or the Haitian revolutionaries said, well, it's impossible to have modern constitutionalism based on equality and liberty and have slavery.
Yeah.
It's impossible.
Yeah. Excellent points, I think.
And
yeah.
so what I'm thinking is, if we start with we put the point that there's only one way to read correctly the Constitution, and the modern constitutions in general, not only the American Constitution, then no constitution can tolerate slavery in any way. So it's.
Yeah, you make an excellent point, I think. I think you make an excellent point because, right, it makes the argument for reparations stronger because you were violating the Constitution. So the argument is that, I think you're making is that, well, they were violating the Constitution at the time, and so why not pay reparations for violations of the Constitution?
This
Yeah,
is my point.
right. I think that's an excellent
And
point.
I think you have been walking with the wrong people in Brazil. Because you don't know the national black movement in Brazil.
Oh, okay. I guess I'm
And
not familiar with
wonderful
it.
people
Yeah.
who had made so many progress in the rights of black people in Brazil.
Okay.
Including the how do you say that? The recognition of quilombos. Have you ever been to a quilombo?
I have, yeah. In Salvador,
Yeah.
I went to one.
So
yeah.
I think this is one important conquest that they
But
had.
why is it in your government you don't have any black people? You never had black
No.
president, vice president,
Because
nothing.
we
President? Black?
yeah.
Oh, did you?
Yes.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Who was that?
Nearly Peçanha.
Okay. Was he recognized as
But
black? Or?
I'm not sure.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay,
a long time ago.
okay, okay,
1910.
okay, okay, okay.
But
Yeah, but I think you make an excellent point. Yeah, if the Constitution was being violated at the time, then you should pay damages, reparations.
But I wanted to tell you about Diva Moreira. Diva Moreira is a professor. She's from Belo Horizonte. We did a small seminary at the beginning of this year with her about reparations.
Oh,
for
okay,
slavery
okay.
Here in Brazil.
Okay, I just did one in
So
Salvador also at Católica.
This is a
Yeah.
movement
That is growing in
Brazil.
Brazil? Okay,
Yes, it
okay.
is
And
growing.
it's an international movement also.
Yeah.
Ghana just had they just had a day calling for reparations, and they reenacted slavery. So it is a movement that's happening.
Colombia also.
Yeah, yeah.
Colombia. And we have a precedent in Brazil for reparations, which is the reparations for
We do
the
also, I was going to
dictatorship.
talk about that. Yeah, right, exactly.
This is already important to read the Constitution in a way that
Right, I think that's an excellent point.
the
Yeah, right.
ex-slaves have the rights.
Right, exactly, yeah. So what, as she was saying, one of the big arguments for reparations is that, well, the United States has paid them before to other victims of injustices. So I have some of those injustices on the screen. We had, during World War II, Japanese Americans were placed in internment camps. Japanese Americans were placed in internment camps. The fear was that they would side with the Japanese during the World War II. Now let me point out, we were also at war against Germany and Italy, and German Americans and Italian Americans were not placed in internment camps. Okay, but Japanese Americans were removed from their homes and their jobs and put in internment camps. They were paid reparations, and were given, I mentioned, an apology. They were actually, the U.S. Congress, Bill signed by Ronald Reagan, ultimately paid them reparations and also issued an official apology for what had happened to them during World War II. That situation, by the way, also produced a horrible Supreme Court decision, a Korematsu decision, which upheld this. Franklin Roosevelt, who's our big hero for many of us, he was the one who signed the order placing Japanese Americans in these internment camps. So they were paid, there were many years of litigation. They were ultimately paid reparations by the Congress. The court said, no, we can't, under our legal doctrines, we cannot provide you with any sort of reparation. The courts urged them to seek relief from Congress. They did that. Congress provided reparations and also an apology. Okay, Native Americans, Congress again provided for reparations to certain Native American tribes for the confiscation of their lands. Okay, the Congress did that. Okay, now this one is interesting. So Washington, D.C., our capital, had slavery. Congress abolished slavery in Washington, D.C. They actually paid reparations to the slave owners who had, in order to encourage them to emancipate their slaves. They were actually, so you had slave owners who actually, slave owners paid reparations, but not, obviously, slaves today and their descendants have not been paid reparations. Yeah. Sure. Oh, sure, sure. Mm-hmm.
So, were there any alternative projects for the constitutional presented during the Constitutional Convention that were anti-slavery or that talked about the end of slavery? Or were there any group of people that could have had the power to step in the decisions made in that moment?
Okay. Yes, there was an attempt by the abolitionists from the North who, from Vermont, places like that. They actually wanted to prohibit slavery under the Constitution. But there was a compromise, basically. So they didn't use the word slavery, but they made certain provisions for it. But there were definitely anti-slavery voices at the Constitutional Convention during the creation of the Constitution. There definitely voices were opposed to slavery. Like I said before, you could not have had, though, a Constitution that would have been accepted if it had been explicitly anti-slavery or explicitly pro-slavery. If it was pro-slavery, the abolitionist states would not have signed on to it. If it was anti-slavery, the southern slaveholding states would not have signed off on it. So it couldn't go either way. But there were voices on both sides, and they compromised. That's why one of my conclusions was that, you know, they never mentioned the word, but it was functionally pro-slavery, the way it actually functioned. Sure, okay. Yeah, so we've had reparations in the past in the United States. One terrible situation, this Tuskegee syphilis study. So what happened was, the United States Health Service, they went to Alabama, and they tested these poor, very poor black men in Alabama in the 1940s. And they discovered, they wanted to study syphilis. Turns out there were a lot of black men, about 600 black men who had syphilis. They led them to believe that they would provide them with health care. And, but what the goal was really to study syphilis and how it would progress untreated. So these 600 black men, the United States Health Service monitored them, but did not provide them with treatment. And they lived most of their lives with syphilis. But they were never told they had syphilis and were never treated for it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think that maybe we should let the questions for the end.
Okay, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll go through, okay,
We'll
quickly.
go through a question and
Okay.
answer at the end.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So yeah, so you had this syphilis. So these black men, they were not treated for syphilis. The government exploited them. They wanted to see, there were treatments available for syphilis, penicillin, but they were never treated. It was later discovered, there was a reporter who discovered that the government, by the way, was actively prohibiting them from being treated. What they did was at Tuskegee, Alabama, they would call around to the doctors in Tuskegee, and they gave the doctors a list. These were all white, you know, there weren't any black doctors at the time. These were all white doctors. They gave them a list of the participants in their study and said, if these men come to you, do not treat them for syphilis. They were explicit. The government told the private doctors, don't treat them for syphilis. They're part of our study. So these men lived most of their life. Then it was discovered that they had syphilis. A reporter discovered. There was actually somebody who worked for the U.S. Public Health Service who told a reporter, then it was revealed that these men were being studied for, it was about a 35-year period. They lived with syphilis and were never treated for it. So what happened was that they were ultimately paid reparations, and also Bill Clinton, president, issued to them an apology. So there is a history of the United States providing for reparations for victims of injustices. And that's one argument that is made for providing for reparations. So there is a history of the United States doing that, okay? What are some of the other arguments, okay, for reparations? Well, one is that, well, the United States is one of the wealthiest country. Where is the wealthiest country in the world? The United States is the wealthiest country in the world. The United States' wealth was based on the backs of slaves. A lot of the wealth was created through slavery, okay? Not just in the South, but also in the North, okay? There were the northern states provided, for instance, they built the ships and they provided the insurance for the slave ships. And there were all sorts of, they also shipped the cotton and some of the products that were produced through slavery. So the United States benefited the wealth. Today, we're the wealthiest country in the world. We benefited, and a lot of that wealth was created through slavery. And so the argument is that because the slaves produced this wealth, there should be reparations paid to their descendants, okay? And so then, as I mentioned before, another argument is that, well, even though slavery has ended, and of course none of the slaves can be paid reparations, the descendants of the slaves could be and should be paid reparations. And why is that? Because of the many of the problems from slavery, the impact of slavery has persisted. As I mentioned before, whites have 10 times the wealth in the United States that black people have. Okay, 10 times, huge wealth gap. Well, how does that get created? That got created through slavery and was perpetuated through slavery, okay? Two ways of building it, two ways in the United States, probably in this country also. How do you build wealth? How do you create wealth in a community? Well, two ways of doing it. One is through education, okay? The problem there is that black people have historically gone to substandard schools that didn't receive the same funding that white schools receive. Even today, most of our schools, I teach civil rights law. We talk about this in my class. Most of our schools in the United States are not legally by law segregated, but most of our schools are segregated. Most black people go to black schools. Most Latinos go to Latino majority schools. Most white people go to majority white schools. Well, why is that? Because we have neighborhood segregation. Black people tend to live in black neighborhoods, white people, and students go to schools in their neighborhood. There were efforts to desegregate the schools, and that effort has basically ended, okay? But schools in black neighborhoods tend not to be as good as schools. They don't have the same sort of equipment and the same resources that schools in white upper class neighborhoods have. And also the way in which we finance schools. So we don't, it used to be they're separate but equal. We had separate schools. Black schools would receive less funding than white schools, okay? So that can't be done today, but the way we fund our schools is based on taxes of the school district. So if you have a black school district, predominantly black school district, they're not going to have the same wealth and the same tax base to provide for the funding of their schools. And that's why you have, whereas you have a lot of wealthy white communities, they have a much broader and greater tax base that they can use to fund the schools. And so that's why we have, same with Latinos also. So that's why we have these continuing educational disparities. More white people go to college. They do better, more black, more white, obviously lawyers, doctors, et cetera, because they go to better schools and better educational opportunities, okay? We had some effort to try to change that, affirmative action, for instance, but our Supreme Court says, no, we can't do that anymore, okay? So you build wealth through education, but that's a problem. You also build wealth through home ownership. Well, through government policy again, homes in black neighborhoods, it's called redlining. And what happened was that the government would actually draw lines, red lines, around black neighborhoods and would refuse to invest in those neighborhoods. So what has happened is that a lot of black neighborhoods don't have the property doesn't have the same value as property in white neighborhoods. So that accounts for a lot of the wealth disparity. So the argument is that we need reparations to make up for the, not only slavery, but these discriminatory governmental policies that have persisted in causing economic disparities among black people, okay? And so these are the arguments that are made in terms of why we should have reparations, okay? What are some of the arguments against reparations, okay? Well, one argument is that in each of the cases that I mentioned, that the reparations were paid to actual victims. So in the case of, for instance, Japanese Americans, those who were interned were actually the victims of that internment. They were paid reparations, okay? The Native Americans who were paid reparations, they were the victims, their land had been confiscated, okay? The black syphilis victims, they were compensated. The ones who had survived that, they were actually compensated, okay? So the argument is that, of course, slaves cannot be compensated because obviously no slaves are still living, okay? So that is one argument that is made, that there's no way to compensate the slavery. In the past, we've compensated actual victims, and these, obviously you don't have any actual direct victims of slavery, okay? And the other argument is, well, how do you determine the payments? How much should the payments be? What form should the payments be? Okay, who should be paid? We have a lot of immigrants from places like Africa, the Caribbean, whose families were not enslaved in the United States. One good example, Barack Obama. His family was not enslaved. Okay, so should he be paid reparations? Okay, we have millions of people like that in the United States. One debate we had over affirmative action was, should affirmative action programs include black people from the Caribbean or from Africa who didn't have a history in the United States of being discriminated against, okay? And so the same argument is made in terms of reparations. Why should they be paid reparations when their families were not enslaved, okay? Another argument is that, well, it's going to create resentment, and it's going to make racial tensions worse, okay? And so, for instance, we have a lot of immigrants in the United States who had nothing to do with slavery. Why should they, if you're from India, why should your tax dollars be paid, used to pay reparations for something you didn't have any responsibility for? If you were from Ireland, you came here after slavery, why should your tax dollars be used to pay reparations, okay? So that's another argument, how would these payments get made and who should they be made to, okay? And then another argument is that, well, we've actually had reparations in the United States, okay? We've had reparations in the form of governmental programs. One is affirmative action. That was a form of reparations. We had affirmative actions from the 1960s until 2026, so about a 50-year period. We had reparations. That was a form of reparations. We also had other government programs, like the Great Society, the War on Poverty, DEI, which now is being dismantled by our current president. So the argument is made is that, well, we've had actually programs that were never called reparations, but they function because black people disproportionately benefited from those programs. And so there's no need to pay reparations, okay? So those are some of the arguments for and against reparations. My thoughts, okay? United States, there is a movement to pay reparations. The current administration is very hostile to that. The United States was one of 3 countries to vote against reparations. So it's certainly not going to happen under the Trump administration, but it is a program, it is a argument that is being made more increasingly, and there are some serious efforts underway, states like California, Maryland, to provide reparations for slavery. And so it's not going to happen anytime soon, but there is an argument for doing so and a movement for doing so, and it was recently bolstered by the UN General Assembly. But those are some of the arguments for and against reparations. And so now I guess we can go ahead and take questions and have a discussion about it.
Okay. So, question and answers. We have time for free questions.
Good evening. I'm
Good evening.
sorry for interrupting
Oh,
you.
no problem, no problem. Sem
Um,
problema. Okay.
I think my question is kind of related with this you just talked about, because it's about the segregation. You said that in the U.S. nowadays you still have the segregations between race. And do you think that is something that would be very different if there was something about slavery, most like anti-slavery on the U.S. Constitution?
Oh, okay. No, I don't think so, because separation of races has just been so ingrained in United States society, starting with slavery and through segregation. And so it's just hard to overcome. You just have a situation where people feel more comfortable being around people of their own race in the United States. It's just it's sort of a comfort level that people have being around people. You know, most people, you go to a bar in the United States, it's going to be either, most of the people there are going to be black, or most of the people are going to be white. You go to a restaurant, you're going to have black restaurants, you're going to have white. It's not that they're prohibited. You can go, if you're white, you can go to a black restaurant. You're white, black, obviously you can go to, but it's just people have a certain comfort level being among their own race, and that's dating back. That's just the way the United States has progressed. It's been ingrained in our country, and it's just hard to overcome that. It's just persisted. We don't have as nearly the interracial, for instance, dating and relationships and marriage that you have here in Brazil. You know, it's just easy to see. You have much interracial mixing and marriages and dating, and we don't have nearly that in the United States.
And I think we, outside of the U.S., we sometimes think that the country is still very racist nowadays. And this segregation maybe is something that affects on this restitution, this continue on the...
So you're saying we do something in the Constitution. Well, let me tell you, so the United States, the problem is that, okay, we have these periods where we try to do something about race, but then we take a step back. That's also been part of our history. So we had slavery. Then we had a period called Reconstruction, where we tried to actually help the former slaves, and they set up programs to help them. But then there was resentment about that. That ended. Okay, we actually had, for a very brief period during Reconstruction, a multiracial democracy where black people were being elected governors, senators from Mississippi and Louisiana. That all stopped. So it was a 60-year period. We basically had apartheid, 60-year period after that. Reconstruction ended 1876. Okay, it ended. And we go into basically an apartheid period, the separate but equal decision, Plessy v. Ferguson. Okay, then we have a movement in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, led by Martin Luther King and others, for civil rights. And of course, we passed the Civil Rights Act. We start affirmative action programs. We make efforts to desegregate our schools. We had programs called busing. We would actually take black kids from black neighborhoods, bus them to white neighborhoods to attend school with whites. We would take white people from white neighborhoods, bus them to black neighborhoods to attend black schools. Okay, we would sue school districts to get them to desegregate their school. So all this was occurring over 1960s, 70s, even into the 80s. Okay, then we have a backlash against all that. So usually what happens is we try to do something to rectify the racial issues, but what soon happens is there's a backlash. We elect Barack Obama president. Who succeeds him? Donald Trump. Okay, that's really the story of America. That really, to me, epitomizes the story of America. We have this great moment. We elect Barack Obama. Many people are saying post-racial. We're a different country. Well, what do we do 8 years later? We elect Donald Trump. There's a huge, there's been a continuing, 5 years ago, just 5 years ago, we have George Floyd is killed. We have a movement in the United States. We have companies bending over backwards saying we're gonna hire more black people. We're gonna have DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs to be more inclusive, universities. And my school started, one of the classes I teach, race and law. We're gonna, well, now there's a big backlash against all that. And companies now are ending their programs, DEI programs, and the government is ending, suing companies over Nike, and if they have any kind of diversity programs, they're being sued now. So that's been a history of the United States. We try to rectify racial issues. There's a backlash to that. Rectify, backlash, rectify, just a continuing pattern that has occurred throughout, So I don't know if there's anything that we could put in the Constitution or any law that we could pass that's gonna change that. How do you change people's hearts?
Yeah, because it's more about social.
Right,
the cultures.
right, exactly, right. It's hard to change people's hearts.
Thank
Yeah, yeah.
For you that are, you are in the first semester? Yeah? No, don't forget to study how this is in Brazil, because it's very important to see racism in Brazil. You have the opportunity to do that. So it's not a matter of better or worse, but different, but we still have the same kind of problem here with racism and all. And perhaps you don't have even backlashes.
You don't have the same
Movement,
backlash that we
yeah,
have.
the movement is perhaps, it's more, the fight against racism perhaps more visible there than here. So try to study that a little bit. You have the opportunity to do that here with lots of modern authors and all. Maria Fernanda, for example, works with this. Lots of our professors works with this kind of problem. Okay, you should read a very good book that's called. I was talking to Marcelo. It's about slavery in Brazil. I love it. It's called a very important book. It's called Defeito de Cor. He said he didn't read because it's very big, but have you heard about it?
I have heard about it. I think it's in Portuguese though,
Yeah,
right?
It's in Portuguese. I was looking if there is an English version, but there isn't. It's a very important book. I think everybody should read it. Have you read it? Have you? Yeah. It's excellent. So to have an idea of what happened there. Okay. Yeah, it's very explicit. That's what your colleague said. It's quite explicit. If you see who are the workers that earn less, you see black people. Who are the who is in jail?
Who's being killed by the police?
The level of education.
Yeah.
It's very explicit. Yeah, well, but there is something we should study more. We are today in a time where we're studying there with another kind of view, which is very important. Okay?
A lot of countries deal with overt. It sounds like you deal with the overt racism, but it's much harder to deal with what's called we call subconscious racism.
Jokes,
Yeah.
way of-
Yeah. So yeah. So. Jobs, education,
Education.
yeah. I spent a lot of time in Bahia, and I just noticed that, like, there are areas, the areas that are wealthier, most of the people live there are white, but most of the workers there are black. Yeah, so I have noticed
we're
that,
studying
yeah.
that now, and it's different, but it's still something that we should study very deeply.
Is there any backlash here to affirmative action?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we had a lot in the United States, and ultimately they succeeded. They ended it, so we don't have any more affirmative action. And the enrollment has gone down, way down in our university since we ended affirmative action. The minority enrollment, African American and Latino has decreased. Yeah, especially in the elite, more elite universities, Harvard.
We
and,
have affirmative action.
you have
in
it
our
here,
university. And it's a very
It's
interesting
mandatory.
process.
It's
It's
mandatory right
Yes.
here, yeah.
And it's very interesting to see. I found it very, very rich for us.
Mhm,
our students.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, so
All the-
we can't have it in the United States anymore. Oh, affirmative action? Yeah, oh, I see. So you're having some of the backlash too?
Yeah,
Yeah,
a
yeah,
backlash,
yeah. Mhm. With that, yeah, same in the United States, yeah. And so they were fighting it, and ultimately they succeeded in the United States in overturning it, yeah. But we had it for about 50 years. We had affirmative action, and our universities and companies had it, and now, in fact, any sort of diversity attempt, Trump is going after, like Nike, you know, the shoe company, they had diversity programs, and now they're being sued, and yeah, it's terrible, yeah. Mhm. Trump is, now one thing they're doing is, he eliminated all the refugees. The only refugees he's allowing into the United States are white South Africans. So, you know, we're parties to the Refugee Convention, which requires us to provide asylum to refugees. But he doesn't allow that, only white South Africans. But if you're from any other country, you're a refugee, you can't enter the United States.
The country is an immigrant country.
Immigrant country, right, exactly. What they're afraid of, United States.
You too, yeah.
Yeah, a whole statute of limitation, yeah. Mhm.
And you know that when the 13th Amendment was issued, some slaveholders moved
to Brazil, I know, yeah, I saw that, yeah, I heard that, yeah, 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 because you abolished your slavery like 30
we
years
were the
after we
last
did,
one.
the last one in North America, yeah, in the Americas, yeah,
I think
right.
in the world.
Oh, okay, I know in the Americas, yeah, yeah.
Even later than Caribbean.
Okay, but at least you didn't need a war though in yours.
And we
yeah.
were the only in the South America
Oh, to still have
to have slaves.
slaves, yeah. Only country in South America that have slaves?
The
Oh,
only one.
okay. But you did vote for the slavery resolution, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So you're his siblings in some of the backlash. We had.
Any question?
Mhm.
The
Yes.
last one.
First of all, I would like to thank you for the presentation.
Sure.
I have a question about the Reconstruction period. Why the Confederacy authorities like Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee weren't prosecuted after the Civil War ended? I have done some research, and I found some arguments that say that they would be persecuted by judges in Richmond, Virginia, that was a former slave state, and that they might found them not guilty, and this would be a big problem. So I would like to know your opinion on the matter.
Yeah, we had unfortunately, Abraham Lincoln was killed, and we had a horrible human being who became president after him. And he was, even though he was against slavery, he was very pro-South. He was from the South, okay? Andrew Johnson was his name, yeah. He was from Tennessee. He didn't favor secession. Now, he thought black people were inferior. He didn't support slavery, but the reason why he didn't support slavery was because he thought it hurt white people, poor whites. He was very poor white himself. And so he was very sympathetic towards the slave owners. And he actually he wanted to provide them with amnesty and to bring them back into the Union. So basically, I don't think it would have worked out the same had Lincoln not been killed, but we just had a pro-Confederate president, because there were provisions of the Constitution that were designed to make sure that the 13th Amendment was written, that, for instance, they couldn't hold office to prevent them from doing certain things. And that was certainly the intent, but having the president undermine that was the reason why they basically had no consequence for being traitors.
So we could say that when Ulysses S. Grant was in the office, the Reconstruction was already
Right, exactly. Andrew Johnson had basically integrated them and given them amnesty, and they were back into so by the time, Ulysses Grant would not have allowed that to happen. But you had Andrew Johnson, who succeeded to the presidency, and he was just so pro-Confederate that he integrated them and gave them amnesty and basically wiped the slate clean. And he was not concerned at all about the farmer. There was the promise of 40 acres and a mule. He undermined all that. Even the civil rights laws that were passed, he was against not the 13th Amendment, he was against the 14th and 15th Amendments. Okay, so everything that was done was again over his objection for black people. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you very much. I want to thank to Kenneth Williams. We learned a lot tonight. E apenas para lembrá-los que amanhã de manhã, às 11 horas, a gente tem uma conferência com o Felipe Recondo. Para quem não está ligando o nome à figura, né, o Felipe Recondo é provavelmente o repórter brasileiro mais especializado em cobertura do Supremo Tribunal Federal. Ele tem 5 livros clássicos já sobre o Supremo, que são os 11, A Toga e o Tanque, um recente que acho que é o que ele vai falar mais, que é sobre como que o Supremo resistiu à tentativa de golpe, e 2 mais técnicos, um sobre o Celso Melo e um sobre o Moreira Alves, 2 ministros muito importantes na história do Supremo. E é também o fundador de um dos sites mais importantes do meio jurídico, que é o Jota. Vai ser muito bom. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. For having me. And I've applied for a Fulbright, and so maybe I will be here next year.
Yes.
But that's possible. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
We are trying to
work out
to have Professor Kenneth Williams with us for a semester.
A semester, yeah,
Next
next year, yeah. So hopefully it'll work out and we can talk about this even more.
So thank you very much.
Okay, sure. Well, that was good. Good questions.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
That's
Very interested students.
Yeah, they seem very interested.
They are the first semester. So perhaps
Oh, their first semester.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That's
Wow.